The wedding photograph radiated pure joy. A beautiful bride in ivory silk and pearls standing beside her handsome groom outside Sacred Heart Cathedral in Chicago's Little Italy, surrounded by family members dressed in their finest clothes for what appeared to be the social event of 1931. But when antique dealer Catherine Romano examined the photograph under her restoration lamp in her vintage shop on Taylor Street, something in the background made her stomach turn cold with recognition and dread. The photograph had been discovered 3 weeks earlier in the estate sale of Maria Benedetto, an elderly woman who had lived alone in a Bridgeport brownstone for 60 years, surrounded by memories she never shared with neighbors or friends. Among boxes of china, jewelry, and handwritten recipes in Italian, Catherine had found this single wedding photograph wrapped in white lace and stored in a rosewood box that also contained a pearl rosary and a letter written in fading ink that simply read, "Some blessings become curses, and some curses become the only way to survive." The inscription on the photograph's ornate silver frame, engraved in elegant script, identified the couple as Antonio and Isabella Benedetto, June 14, 1931, united in love, protected by faith, surrounded by family. The bride's dress was clearly expensive, made from imported silk with intricate beadwork that caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the cathedral's stained glass windows. The groom wore a perfectly tailored morning coat with a white rose boutonniere, his dark hair slicked back in the fashion of successful young men who had prospered during Prohibition's golden years. Dozens of wedding guests filled the frame. Elderly women in black dresses and elaborate hats, children in sailor suits and white Mary Janes, men in dark suits who carried themselves with the confident bearing of those who controlled their own destinies. Everyone was smiling, laughing, celebrating what appeared to be a perfect union between two families who had found prosperity and happiness in their adopted American homeland. But standing directly behind the groom, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was a figure that shouldn't have been there. A man whose presence at this joyful celebration would have been impossible if the official records were accurate. The man wore a dark suit identical to the other wedding guests, but his face was partially obscured by shadow, and his eyes seemed to be watching something beyond the camera's range, as if he was expecting trouble that only he could anticipate. Catherine had spent 15 years dealing in vintage photographs from Chicago's Italian-American community, but she had never seen anything that made her hands shake the way they did when she realized who was standing behind Antonio Benedetto on what should have been the happiest day of his life. The man in the shadows was Salvatore the Ghost Torino, Vincent Torino's older brother, who, according to every newspaper account and police record Catherine could find, had been shot dead outside the Biograph Theater 6 months before this wedding took place. The date stamp on the photographer's studio mark confirmed Catherine's worst fears. Benedetto Castellano Wedding, June 14, 1931, Sacred Heart Cathedral, captured exactly 6 months and 12 days after Salvatore Torino had supposedly been gunned down in a hail of bullets outside the movie theater, where John Dillinger would meet his fate 3 years later. Yet here he stood, very much alive, his distinctive profile unmistakable, despite the careful way he had positioned himself to avoid direct exposure to the camera's lens. Catherine pulled out the manila folder she kept filled with newspaper clippings from Chicago's Prohibition-era violence, articles she collected to help authenticate the vintage photographs that occasionally passed through her shop. The Chicago Tribune's front page from December 2, 1930 featured a dramatic headline, "Torino Brother Slain in Theater District Ambush," with a photograph showing Salvatore's bullet-riddled Cadillac and bloodstains on the sidewalk outside the Biograph. The article described how rival gunmen had waited for Salvatore to exit the evening showing of All Quiet on the Western Front, then opened fire with Thompson submachine guns, leaving him dead before police could arrive. The funeral had been equally dramatic, according to the Chicago Sun's coverage from December 5, 1930. Over 1,000 mourners had attended the service at St. Bartholomew's Church, including representatives from every major family in Chicago's underworld. The funeral procession stretched for 2 miles, with more than 50 cars following the hearse to Mount Carmel Cemetery, where Salvatore was laid to rest in a marble mausoleum that cost more than most people earned in 5 years. But as Catherine studied the wedding photograph more carefully, using a jeweler's loupe to examine every detail, She noticed other disturbing inconsistencies that suggested this image contained secrets that went far deeper than one man's impossible resurrection. The shadows fell wrong around Salvatore's figure, as if he existed in slightly different lighting conditions than the rest of the wedding party. His reflection was missing from the cathedral's polished brass doors visible in the background, and most unnervingly, none of the other wedding guests seemed to acknowledge his presence despite the fact that he was standing close enough to touch the groom's shoulder. The bride, Isabella, appeared radiant in all the expected ways. Her smile was genuine, her eyes sparkled with happiness, and she held her new husband's arm with the confidence of a woman who believed she was beginning the best chapter of her life. But when Catherine examined Isabella's face through the magnifying glass, she noticed something that made her breath catch. The bride's eyes, while bright with joy, also carried a shadow of fear that seemed completely at odds with the celebration surrounding her. Antonio, the groom, looked every inch the successful young businessman that newspaper society pages would later describe as a rising star in Chicago's legitimate construction industry. His smile was confident, his posture relaxed, and he gazed at his new bride with obvious devotion. But his left hand, the one not holding Isabella's arm, was clenched into a fist so tight that Catherine could see the tension in his knuckles even through the sepia tones of the vintage photograph. What disturbed Catherine most was the growing realization that this wasn't just a photograph of a wedding. It was documentation of something far more complex and dangerous, a moment when multiple secrets had converged in front of a camera that had captured far more truth than anyone intended. The marriage records at Sacred Heart Cathedral told a story that contradicted everything Catherine thought she understood about the families involved in this mysterious wedding photograph. Father Benedetti, the elderly priest who had served the parish for 47 years and had officiated at hundreds of weddings for Chicago's Italian-American families, remembered the ceremony with unusual clarity when Catherine visited him at the rectory on a rainy Thursday afternoon in November. The Benedetto Castellano wedding was unlike any other ceremony I performed during my years at Sacred Heart, Father Benedetti said, his weathered hands folding and unfolding a white handkerchief as he spoke. Both families were prominent in the community, but there was a tension in the air that day that I had never experienced before or since. The bride was genuinely in love, that much was clear, but the groom carried himself like a man who was fulfilling an obligation rather than celebrating a joy. The priest's records showed that the wedding had been planned for over a year, with extensive preparations that included importing flowers from Italy, commissioning a custom wedding dress from a boutique in New York, and arranging for a reception that would host over 300 guests at the Drake Hotel. But Father Benedetti also revealed something that wasn't recorded in any official document. The wedding had originally been scheduled for December 15, 1930, but had been postponed at the last minute due to what the families described as unexpected business complications. December 15, 1930 was exactly 13 days after Salvatore Torino's supposed murder outside the Biograph Theater, a timing that couldn't possibly be coincidental. Catherine spent the next week traveling between Chicago's public libraries, newspaper archives, and courthouse records, following leads that seemed to create more questions than answers about the true nature of the relationships between the Benedetto, Castellano, and Torino families during Prohibition's most violent period. At the Chicago Historical Society, Catherine discovered a collection of society photographs from 1931 that had never been published, images taken at various charity events, business gatherings, and social functions throughout the year. In photograph after photograph, she found evidence that Salvatore Torino had continued to appear at public events throughout 1931, always positioning himself carefully to avoid direct camera angles, always standing where shadows would obscure his features, but unmistakably present at gatherings where his attendance should have been impossible. The Cook County Clerk's office yielded even more disturbing information when Catherine examined the property records for the Benedetto family's construction business. On June 15, 1931, exactly one day after the wedding, Antonio Benedetto had signed over controlling interest in his company to a holding company called ST Enterprises, transferring assets worth over $2 million to an organization that had no traceable owners, no business address, and no tax records with the state of Illinois. Maria Benedetto's neighbor, Mrs. Giuseppe Marcelli, agreed to meet Catherine at a coffee shop near the old neighborhood where both women had lived for decades. Mrs. Marcelli was 86 years old, with sharp eyes and a memory that seemed to catalog every secret that had ever been whispered in the close-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business. But some things were never discussed openly. Maria never spoke about her wedding day, Mrs. Marcelli said, stirring sugar into her espresso with hands that trembled slightly with age. For 60 years I lived next door to that woman, and she never once mentioned the happiest day of her life. Every other wife in the neighborhood would tell stories about their wedding, show photographs to their grandchildren, celebrate their anniversaries with pride. But Maria kept that day locked away like it was something shameful instead of something beautiful. Mrs. Marcelli leaned forward and lowered her voice to a whisper. The only time I ever saw Maria look at that wedding photograph was late at night, when she thought no one could see her through the kitchen window. She would hold it in her hands and cry like her heart was breaking. And then she would put it away and never speak of it again. Catherine's breakthrough came when Mrs. Marcelli mentioned that Maria Benedetto had left behind a trunk in her basement that contained items she had never shown to anyone during her lifetime. Inside the trunk, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper and hidden beneath decades of Christmas decorations and baby clothes that had never been used, Catherine discovered a collection of letters that revealed the true story behind the wedding photograph that had haunted her for weeks. The letters were correspondence between Isabella Castellano and her sister Rose, who had moved to Boston in 1929 to marry a Harvard-educated lawyer and escape what she described as the family business that was destroying everything beautiful in our lives. The letters spanned from January 1931 to December 1931, documenting Isabella's engagement, wedding, and the first 6 months of a marriage that was far more complicated than the joyful celebration captured in the cathedral photograph. My dearest Rose, Isabella had written in a letter dated February 14, 1931. I know you warned me about marrying into a family whose prosperity comes from sources that decent people don't discuss in polite company. But Antonio is different from his associates. He wants to build a legitimate business, to raise children who will never have to look over their shoulders or worry about the sins of their fathers. He has promised me that after we are married, he will sever all connections with the elements of his past that have brought shame to our community. But by April 1931, Isabella's letters had taken on a tone of growing concern and confusion, as she began to understand that her fiancé's promises might be more complicated to fulfill than either of them had anticipated. Antonio had confided in her that his construction business was deeply entangled with financial backing from sources that he couldn't simply abandon without serious consequences for both their families. The wedding, rather than being a celebration of new beginnings, was becoming a carefully orchestrated business transaction that would bind their families together in ways that went far beyond marriage. Antonio told me something last night that has left me unable to sleep, Isabella wrote in May 1931. The man who has been his business partner, the one who provided the money for all of our wedding preparations, the one who has promised to protect our future together. He is supposed to be dead. Everyone believes he died 6 months ago, but he has been living in hiding, using Antonio's business as a way to remain invisible while he rebuilds his influence from the shadows. Our wedding is not just a celebration of love, it is his public resurrection. The letters revealed that Salvatore Torino had staged his own death outside the Biograph Theater as part of an elaborate plan to escape federal prosecution that had been closing in on his operations throughout 1930. The ambush had been carefully orchestrated with the body of a vagrant who resembled Salvatore being substituted for his own, while Salvatore himself had been smuggled out of Chicago and hidden at a safe house in Wisconsin until the federal investigation moved on to other targets. But Salvatore's plan required more than just faking his death. He needed a way to rebuild his organization without drawing attention from law enforcement agencies that believed he was safely buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery. Antonio Benedetto's legitimate construction business provided the perfect cover, offering a way for Salvatore to launder money, employ his associates, and gradually reconstruct his influence while maintaining the fiction that he had died a martyr to rival gang violence. The wedding served multiple purposes in this elaborate deception. It would publicly bind the Benedetto and Castellano families together, creating a legitimate business alliance that could explain any financial connections between their organizations. It would also provide Salvatore with an opportunity to make his first public appearance since his supposed death, testing whether anyone would recognize him or whether his disguise was sufficiently effective to allow him to gradually resume a more active role in Chicago's underworld. "I am marrying the man I love," Isabella wrote in her final letter before the wedding, "but I am also becoming an unwilling partner in a deception that could destroy everything we hope to build together. Antonio believes we can navigate this dangerous path and eventually find our way to the honest life we both want. But I fear we are stepping into quicksand that will swallow us both." The letters from after the wedding painted a picture of a marriage that was simultaneously blessed with genuine love and cursed by circumstances that neither Antonio nor Isabella had fully understood when they exchanged vows at Sacred Heart Cathedral. Isabella's correspondence with her sister revealed that Salvatore's presence at the wedding had been far more significant than a simple test of his disguise. It had been the beginning of a plan that would fundamentally change both their lives in ways they could never have anticipated. "My dearest Rose," Isabella wrote in July 1931, "the past month has been the strangest of my entire life. By day, Antonio and I live like any other newlywed couple. We tend to our home, plan for our future, discuss the children we hope to have, and the legitimate business we want to build together. But by night, our house becomes a meeting place for men who speak in whispers about territories and debts and vengeance that must be paid for offenses that happened before I was born." Salvatore had not simply been hiding from federal investigators. He had been orchestrating an elaborate plan to eliminate the rival family members who had believed they were responsible for his death and had moved to claim territories that had previously been under his control. The wedding photograph had served as proof of life that Salvatore could use to reclaim his position, but it had also made Antonio and Isabella unwilling participants in a war that would consume the next several years of their lives. "Antonio tried to protect me from the worst of it," Isabella continued in a letter dated September 1931. "But I could see the toll it was taking on his soul. The man who promised me a life of honesty and respectability was being forced to make choices that contradicted everything he believed about right and wrong. Salvatore had saved Antonio's construction business from bankruptcy in 1929, and now he was calling in that debt in ways that threatened to destroy the very prosperity he had made possible. The most devastating revelation came in Isabella's letter from November 1931, where she described the true cost of Salvatore's resurrection and the price that her marriage would pay for the deception that had brought them together. Federal investigators had indeed moved on from their interest in Salvatore's organization, but they had been replaced by rival families who had discovered that Salvatore was still alive and were now targeting anyone who had helped him maintain his deception. "3 men came to our house last Tuesday while Antonio was at work," Isabella wrote, her handwriting becoming increasingly shaky as she described the encounter. "They knew about the wedding photograph. They knew about Salvatore's presence at our ceremony, and they knew that our marriage was part of his plan to return from the dead. They gave me a choice that no wife should ever have to make. I could help them locate Salvatore and end his second life permanently, or I could watch them destroy everything Antonio had worked to build, including the family we were hoping to start together." Isabella's final letters revealed that she had chosen to protect her husband and their future together, even though it meant becoming an informant against the man who had made their prosperity possible. She had provided Salvatore's enemies with information about his movements, his hiding places, and his plans for reclaiming his lost territories. But her betrayal had come too late to save her marriage from the consequences of Salvatore's deception. "Antonio discovered what I had done on Christmas Eve 1931, Isabella wrote in her last letter to Rose, dated December 31st, 1931. "He looked at me with eyes that no longer recognized the woman he had married, and I realized that some choices destroy not just the people who make them, but everyone who loves those people." Salvatore died for real on December 23, 1931, shot down in the same alley where his fake death had been staged 13 months earlier. Antonio left our house on Christmas morning and never returned. I have spent the last week of this year sitting alone in the home we were supposed to fill with children and laughter, wondering if love can survive the weight of too many secrets. The letter was signed, Isabella Benedetto, but there was a postscript written in different ink. I have decided to keep Antonio's name, even though he can no longer bear to keep mine. Some promises survive even when the people who made them cannot. Catherine spent the next month trying to locate any descendants of Antonio and Isabella Benedetto, following leads through genealogical websites, church records, and immigration documents that painted a picture of a family that had deliberately scattered across the country to escape the consequences of their patriarch's involvement in Salvatore Torino's elaborate deception. Her persistence finally paid off when she located Thomas Benedetto, Antonio's grandnephew, who was working as a history professor at Northwestern University and had spent years trying to understand why his family had been so secretive about their past. My grandfather never spoke about his older brother Antonio, Thomas told Catherine when they met at a quiet restaurant near the university campus. All I knew was that Antonio had been successful in construction during the 1930s, had married into a prominent Italian family, and had then disappeared from Chicago sometime before World War II. The family treated his name like a curse that couldn't be spoken aloud, and anyone who asked too many questions about what had happened to him was told to focus on the future instead of digging up a past that was better left buried. Thomas had brought with him a shoebox containing items that had been passed down through his family for generations. Photographs, letters, and documents that had been carefully preserved, but never explained. Among these items was a newspaper clipping from the Chicago Tribune, dated January 15, 1932, with a headline that read, "Prominent construction executive leaves Chicago under mysterious circumstances." The article reported that Antonio Benedetto had sold his business interests and departed the city abruptly, leaving behind speculation about financial difficulties and possible connections to organized crime figures who had recently been targeted by federal investigators. But Thomas also possessed something that Catherine had not expected to find: a letter that Antonio had written to his family in 1942, mailed from San Francisco, and explaining his sudden departure from Chicago a decade earlier. The letter revealed that Antonio had indeed left his wife and his business behind, but not because he no longer loved Isabella, or because their marriage had been irreparably damaged by the choices they had been forced to make. "I left Chicago because staying would have meant watching Isabella live in constant fear for the rest of her life," Antonio had written. "As long as I remained in the city, she would always be a target for people who believed she had betrayed Salvatore, or who thought she possessed information that could be valuable to their own ambitions. By disappearing, I could give her the opportunity to rebuild her life without the burden of our shared past. It was the most difficult decision I have ever made, but it was also the most loving thing I could do for the woman who had sacrificed her own safety to protect our future together." Antonio's letter also revealed that he had continued to provide financial support for Isabella throughout the 1930s and 1940s, sending money through intermediaries who ensured that she could maintain her independence and dignity while building a new life that was completely separate from the world of violence and deception that had shaped their brief marriage. He had never remarried, had never started the family they had planned together, and had spent the remaining 40 years of his life working as a carpenter in California, building houses for other people's families while carrying the memory of the love he had been forced to abandon. Catherine shared the wedding photograph with Thomas, watching his face as he studied the image of his great-uncle's wedding day, and began to understand the complex web of loyalty, sacrifice, and love that had shaped his family's hidden history. When she pointed out Salvatore Torino's ghostly presence behind the groom, Thomas stared at the photograph for several minutes without speaking. "Now I understand why my grandfather used to say that some photographs capture more than just a moment in time," Thomas finally said. "This image documents the exact instant when my great-uncle's life changed forever, when a day that should have been pure joy became the beginning of a tragedy that would separate him from everything he loved most in the world." Catherine arranged to donate the wedding photograph and Isabella's letters to the Chicago History Museum, where they now rest in a special exhibition about love and sacrifice during Prohibition's most turbulent period. The museum's placard reads, "Wedding Day Secrets, 1931. A reminder that some photographs document not just celebrations, but the moment when joy and sorrow become inseparable, when love proves its strength by accepting impossible choices." Visitors see a beautiful bride and handsome groom surrounded by family and friends, But few noticed the ghostly figure standing behind the couple, the man whose presence would ultimately transform a wedding day into a farewell. Thomas Benedetto has become a regular visitor to the museum, often bringing his own children to see the photograph and explain how their family's story demonstrates that love sometimes requires sacrifice that extends far beyond what anyone should have to bear. He tells them about Antonio and Isabella, who loved each other enough to make choices that would keep them apart for the rest of their lives, and about the complex moral landscape that their ancestors navigated during a time when survival often required compromising the very principles that made life worth living. The museum's research department has confirmed that Isabella Benedetto never remarried, never had children, and never left Chicago after Antonio's departure. She lived quietly in the same house where she had briefly known happiness, working as a seamstress and sending care packages to soldiers during World War II. Neighbors remembered her as a kind but mysterious woman, who always seemed to be waiting for someone who never returned, carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had made peace with a broken heart. Antonio Benedetto died in San Francisco in 1982, exactly 51 years after his wedding day. Among his possessions, his landlord found a small wooden box containing dozens of letters that he had written to Isabella, but never sent, along with newspaper clippings documenting her involvement in various charitable activities throughout the decades. The letters revealed that he had followed her life from a distance, celebrating her small triumphs and grieving her sorrows, maintaining a connection that transcended physical presence and geographical separation. The wedding photograph serves as proof that some love stories don't end with happily ever after, but rather with a deeper understanding of what it means to protect someone, even when protection requires the ultimate sacrifice of separation. Antonio and Isabella's marriage lasted only 7 months in terms of physical togetherness, but their love endured for 51 years through the choices they made to keep each other safe from the consequences of a world they had never chosen to enter. Salvatore the Ghost Torino achieved his goal of returning from the dead, but his resurrection came at a cost that extended far beyond his own life. His presence at the wedding created ripples that would affect 2 families for generations, proving that some secrets are too powerful to remain buried, and some deceptions carry consequences that outlive everyone who participated in creating them. In the end, the wedding photograph captures the exact moment when love proved stronger than happiness, when 2 people chose to sacrifice their own joy to protect each other from a world that had already taken too much from too many. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories are also the most heartbreaking, and sometimes the happiest day of someone's life is also the day they learn that love requires courage that most people can never imagine possessing. Antonio and Isabella Benedetto learned that some wedding vows include promises that neither bride nor groom fully understands until it's too late to change their minds, but not too late to honor their love through sacrifice.